By a show of hands, and those that are watching us from someplace else, you can raise your hand too. How many people believe in miracles? More people than you would expect. You know, there's an Israeli saying that if you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist. Miracles, of course, are something that religion is known for, especially in the Bible. Especially in the Bible. In the Bible, we have all sorts of miracles. We have most prominently the one that we recall every day in our tefillah, in our prayer. We have the miracle, the splitting of the Red Sea. We have the miracle of creation itself. We have the miracle of Balaam and his talking donkey. We have the miracle of the Akedah, when Abraham is prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. Just suddenly there happens to be a ram caught in the thicket, conveniently placed in order to replace Isaac for that sacrifice. And more and more and more miracles. We could just go through the Bible and we can see all sorts of miracles. What's interesting is that the Bible has no word for miracle. There's no word for miracle. There's no ness in the Torah itself. Instead, we have words of wonder and signs. We have ot, for example, we have signs. That's because for the Bible, for the Torah, in the ancient world in particular, they didn't see miracles as necessarily standing outside of the natural order of the world, in the sense that if God is God and God creates the world, then the miracle that occurs at that particular moment is part of creation. So there was no need in the ancient world to differentiate between the parting of the Red Sea and the fact that the sun comes up in the morning. And in fact, if you read the Torah, these events happen in the narrative of the Torah as if they are part of the ordinary process of what happens within the Torah. They're not really called out in any special way. Hanukkah, of course, is a holiday in which we celebrate a miracle. What's the miracle of Hanukkah? The oil, right? The miracle of Hanukkah is this oil. The temple is destroyed. The Maccabees fight a war to kick out the oppressors. They reestablish the Beit Mikdash, the temple, and they go looking for it's more than a vial, but they go looking for a container of oil that has the seal of the high priest on it, such that they can burn the menorah and rededicate the Beit Mikdash. And in the rubble, they find just one container, enough for 1 day of oil, and lo and behold, a miracle occurs, and it lasts for 8. Another folk saying, why do we have latkes on Hanukkah? Does anyone know this one? Why do we have latkes on Hanukkah? You're going to say because it's the oil and so forth and so on, and sufganiyot and so forth. But the folk saying is we have latkes on Hanukkah because you can't live on miracles alone. I'm not sure you could live on latkes alone either, or at least not with any kind of health. But you can't live on miracles alone. So we have latkes on Hanukkah because people have to eat. Now, I asked at the beginning of the Torah reading, what are the connections that we can find between Parashat Miketz and Hanukkah? How do we apply this to the story of Joseph, to Parashat Miketz? Anyone want to venture a response? What are the connections between Joseph and Miketz to Hanukkah? It's going to be fun when we go to this on a regular basis. Well, let's start with what appears in the Chumash itself that I pointed everyone's attention to on page 250, the comment by Rabbi Harold Kushner, that Hanukkah celebrates the victory of the weak over the powerful. The Parsha begins with Pharaoh's dream on lean cows conquering the well-fed ones, and the Parsha begins with Joseph in prison and ends with Joseph as the ruler. And the story of Hanukkah begins with Israel oppressed and ends with Israel triumphant and independent. Certainly those are there too. But we also see that God is hiding behind the scenes within the unfolding of the story. And there seems to be all sorts of miracles that are taking place. Parshat Vayeshev, I always point out who for me is the most important character in the entire Torah. The mysterious Ish, who just happens to be at the right place at the right time when Joseph is looking for his brothers. And before Joseph can even ask, hey, by the way, have you seen a group of brothers tending sheep? Where did they go? This person offers an answer to Joseph and says, your brothers went that way. And Joseph goes and follows him. And if it wasn't for that person in the right place at the right time, telling Joseph where to go, and as Henry Kissinger used to say, the art of diplomacy is telling people where to go in such a way they look forward to the journey. If there wasn't for that person telling Joseph where to go, he wouldn't have found his brothers, he wouldn't have been thrown in the pit, he wouldn't have been sold into slavery, he wouldn't have found himself in Egypt, he wouldn't have become the vizier as he does in our Parsha. The Israelites wouldn't have gone down to Egypt, we wouldn't have been redeemed, we would not have received the Ten Commandments. Everything that unfolds in the Torah happens because of this mysterious Ish, a person without a name who just happens to be in the right place at the right time. And so we see God's hand operating behind the scenes in ways that one could look at as being miraculous. This person who happens to be there. We have all sorts of elements of God in this story. We have sibling rivalry, we have parental meddling, we have deception, we have lust, we have political ambition, guilt and revenge, but God seems to be kind of either pulling the strings or pushing people along depending upon which theology you want to adopt. In Pharaoh's dreams, where there just happens to be Joseph in jail, able to interpret them. When finally the cupbearer remembers that he's there and he can interpret it. The cupbearer is not being altruistic here. He's thinking about his own behind. But he can save it if he pulls Joseph out of jail. And Joseph reveals himself. The same is true with the story of Hanukkah. Is the story really a miracle? Is the miracle of the Hanukkah story something that seems abnormal from nature, which is the folk tradition that we all adopt, that the oil is the miracle that lasts for 8 days? Or is the miracle something else? Is the miracle that a small band of Israelites, of Jews, of Maccabees, pulled together in order to stand up and fight for their religious freedom and their political freedom, their sovereignty as well? Perhaps the miracle is that they won this battle, the few over the many. And think about it from a theological perspective, and this is what I think is really essential about the Hanukkah story. The miracle of the oil only happens after the fact. The miracle of Hanukkah is not that God intervenes directly. There's no parting of the Red Sea by which the Maccabees can walk through. There's no miraculous element of battle by which the Maccabees persevere and are victorious. They fight. They win. The miracle only comes afterwards. It's as if God is saying to us, in this case, that when we human beings stand up to push away the darkness for the light, the reward will be the extension of that light from 1 day to 8. It's very, very different than the theology of Christmas, Christian theology. In Christian theology, the world is so dark, the world is so evil, the only way it can be redeemed is God has to send God's Son as Isaac on Har Moriah to be sacrificed for the sins of the people in order to create renewal and redemption. The lights for Christmas and on the Christmas tree are all about God's light intervening to push away the darkness for the light. And the Christmas tree itself is an evergreen for the resurrection of Jesus in theology. Most Christians, by the way, are not aware of this theology. And just like most Jews, when we ask what's the miracle of Hanukkah, we say the oil, because that's the folk tradition by which we are brought up with. But when we take a step back to think about it, and to think about it in the sense of what's the message of Jewish theology at this moment, the message of Jewish theology, the message of Jewish tradition is Al tismoch al hanes. You can't live on latkes alone, and you can't rely on miracles. Even to the point that the rabbis already began to reinterpret the miracles in the Torah so that they put them specifically at the time of creation. Lest you think the parting of the Red Sea was something that wasn't meant to happen in the natural course of the world, you need to know that God planned it at the moment of creation. Just like everything else in the world, just like the sun comes up in the morning and the moon comes out at night, day rolls into darkness, darkness into night, God created the parting of the Red Sea at the time of creation to happen in that moment, as well as other miracles that seem out of place. The rabbis wanted to put what seemed abnormal into the normal course of the world. And the rabbis went even further with teachings like the one I just quoted, Al tismoch al hanes. You can't rely on miracles. They even prohibited one from relying on miracles. There's a story from the Talmud in Ta'anit. Rabbi Yanai said one should never stay in a place of danger. You can't stay in a place of danger because you can't say to yourself, I shall be safe from a miracle, for perhaps no miracle will be brought. You know, we all know the joke that is built on this teaching from Rabbi Yanai. The flood comes, right? This is the story of the flood. And the sheriff comes and knocks on the door and says, the flood's coming, you have to leave. He goes to the second floor, the sheriff comes back on a boat and says, the flood's coming, you have to leave. The flood's now on up to the second floor of the house. The guy's on the roof of the house. The sheriff comes back with a helicopter, drops a ladder, says, you have to leave. The guy dies. He goes then into heaven. He stands before Kadosh Baruch Hu. He says, God, why didn't you save me for a miracle? And God looks at him and says, what are you talking about? First I sent the sheriff on the door. Then I sent him in a boat. Then I sent him by a helicopter. You have to meet me halfway. Al tismach al hanes. You can't rely on miracles. It comes from that joke comes from this teaching in the Talmud. And the Talmud takes it even one step further. It gives a story of Rab Huna who stored wine in a building that was in need of repair. He wanted to remove the wine, so he took Rabbi Ada bar Ahava and he placed him in the wine cellar and he asked him to pray. And at the moment that Rav Ada bar Ahava stopped praying and all the wine had been removed from the cellar, the wine cellar collapsed and was destroyed. Now Rav Ada realized that he'd been manipulated and used for the purpose of creating a miracle for Rav Huna to be able to take out all of his wine. And he was annoyed. And he agreed with the view of Rabbi Yanai that I just quoted, that a person shall not stay in a place of danger because al tismoch al hanes. You can't rely on miracles. So what's the miracle? The miracle comes in the interpretation, in the mishkafayim, in the glasses, the lens by which we view the world. Chaim Weitzman says that miracles sometimes occur but we have to work awfully hard for them. Joseph had to work awfully hard for it. The butler had to work awfully hard for it. And the butler had to remember Joseph, had to create a network, a community. For the Maccabees too, the miracle of the Maccabees didn't just happen. They had to work awfully hard for it. If you read the book of the Maccabees, they had to unite not only their family and their tribe, but they had to unite the different segments of the Jewish people in order to fight against the Assyrian Greeks. And then they had to fight a war in order for that miracle to occur. The same is true for Jewish life. If we want our kids and our grandkids to be Jewish, then we have to create it, a Jewish home shaped by Jewish values. It doesn't happen by osmosis. It happens with kavanah, with intention. Al tismoch al anes. We read Torah, thousands of years of Jewish experience, of stories of generations of Jews that have celebrated the highest ups that a people can imagine as well as the lowest lows and have persevered and overcome. I spoke about this at Rosh Hashanah. Think about the juxtaposition of the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel. What would happen if the Shoah of the Holocaust was the last word of Jewish history and we didn't have the State of Israel? But the State of Israel didn't just happen 3 years after the Shoah, and it didn't just happen because of the Shoah. It happened because Theodor Herzl had a dream, and he took action on that dream. And at the time in which he was doing that, most of the Jewish world ridiculed him, and they couldn't imagine that it would happen. But Israel didn't happen by a nes. It didn't happen by a miracle. It happened because people worked hard in order to create it. Al tismoch al nes. In our prayer book, we are reminded of this too. It comes in the section Modim. Every day when we recite the Amidah, when we give thanks to God, what do we thank God for? Va'al nisecha shebechol yom imanu, for all the miracles that are daily with us. Va'al niflotecha, for all of the signs, v'tovotecha, and all the good works, shebechol et, that happen all the time. Erev vavoker v'tzorayim, in the morning, in the evening, and in the afternoon. For Jews, miracles are not abnormalities in nature. They are revelations that we teach ourselves to see and appreciate morning, noon, and night. It's what Abraham Joshua Heschel called radical amazement, training ourselves to see the world with awe and to see the miraculous nature of possibility that exists every day. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Orim Sameach.